An old black man in a shabby, patched-up coat and worn-out shoes stepped quietly into Westmore Bank. His gray curls peeked from under a faded cap, and on his shoulder hung a tattered canvas bag that looked older than anyone in the room. His face, lined with decades of hardship, showed no fear, only calm, as he looked around the elegant marble lobby and softly said, "This bank is mine." The reaction was instant. The room burst into mocking laughter. Customers chuckled with disbelief. Clerks exchanged smirks, whispering jokes under their breath. A wealthy woman clutched her purse tighter, glaring, and the head of security, scowling, stepped forward with his hand near his radio, ready to call the police and throw the man out. But then the old man slowly lowered his canvas bag to the floor. With trembling fingers, he began to open it. The laughter faltered. What was inside wasn't nonsense or a threat, but something so powerful, so unexpected, that the entire room fell into stunned, breathless silence. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in East Haven, a mid-sized city tucked between the aging railroads of Illinois and the glimmering towers of its corporate skyline. The Westmore Bank, an institution so old that most residents referred to it as the city's spine, buzzed with routine energy. The high ceilings echoed the sounds of keyboard clacks, muffled conversations, and the shuffling of polished leather shoes over marble floors. Customers, some in tailored suits, others in yoga pants and cardigans, lined up with a calm indifference, scrolling through their phones, waiting to deposit checks, transfer funds, or simply complain about interest rates. Behind the counters, young employees moved with robotic efficiency, their faces composed, their eyes glossed with the dullness of repetition. That was when a mysterious man appeared. The moment the front doors of Westmore Bank slowly creaked open, a sharp gust of cold wind followed behind, carrying with it the scent of rust-damp earth and something else. Something older, like forgotten alleyways or empty train stations at midnight. Every conversation in the lobby seemed to falter, not because of anything grand or dramatic, but because someone had entered who didn't belong. At first, no one paid much attention. Just another customer, maybe an old man coming in to ask about a savings account or trying to get help with online banking. But as the figure stepped in, the rhythm of the bank faltered for a moment, not stopped, but slightly off-beat, like a chord out of tune. An old black man crossed the threshold slowly, each step careful, deliberate. He was thin, tall, but slightly hunched, as if the years had been stacked onto his back like bricks. His face was marked by deep creases, lines carved not only by time, but by hardship and silence. His silver curls twisted chaotically beneath a worn-out newsboy cap, and his thick brown coat, patched with mismatched fabric and speckled with dirt, clung to him like it had endured decades of winters. His pants were faded, the hems frayed and dragging slightly over scuffed shoes whose soles had begun to peel. Slung across his shoulder was a faded canvas bag, the kind soldiers once carried in old war films, heavy-tired but not defeated. He stood there for a moment, just inside the door, letting the warmth of the bank's lobby fight against the cold that clung to his coat. His eyes, dark and clear, scanned the space not with confusion, but with purpose. Not a single movement he made was wasted. He didn't shuffle like the lost or mumble like the senile. He walked forward slow and steady, and every step made people pause just slightly, just enough to notice. An elderly woman with pearl earrings and a fur-lined coat stepped back, clutching her handbag and whispering with sharp annoyance to the clerk behind the counter, "You need to call your manager. Now. We don't feel safe." A younger woman, maybe in her early 30s, well-groomed in corporate athleisure and carrying a Louis Vuitton purse, stepped to the side and took out her phone. "Not to help, to record." "This is exactly the kind of thing I keep talking about," she said loudly, hoping others would hear. "Why are there no policies in place for this kind of disturbance?" A child clutched his mother's coat, asking in a frightened whisper, "Is he sick?" "No, dear," the mother replied curtly, pulling the child away. "He's just dirty." Behind the glass counter, a young teller named Joshua whispered to his colleague Mabel with a smirk, "Looks like someone wandered in from the shelter again." Mabel, without looking up from her screen, replied, "They really need to start locking the doors." The old man didn't react. His gaze remained calm, unreadable. The whispers, the stares, the faint mockery, none of it touched him. He kept walking until he reached the very center of the marble lobby, where the light from the tall windows poured down in soft golden rays. It made him glow in a quiet, almost spiritual way. And then, in a voice low but unmistakably clear, he said the words that made time itself hesitate. "This bank," he declared, "is mine." At first no one laughed. They were too stunned, too confused by what they thought they had heard. Then the scoffing began. Soft chuckles rippled through the room. Snorts, sneers, and finally, open laughter. Some customers chuckled and shook their heads. Others openly scoffed as if they'd just witnessed a performance too absurd to take seriously. Joshua let out a sharp laugh and nudged Mabel, whispering, "This one thinks he owns Westmore Bank." What's next? The Empire State Building, near the wall. Charles Denton, the head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered white man in his early 50s, watched with a mixture of disdain and irritation. He began to walk toward the old man, his steps precise, his presence designed to dominate. Charles had worked at Westmore Bank for nearly 20 years and prided himself on keeping order. He was a man who believed in control and structure in hierarchy, and he especially believed that people like the old man standing before him did not belong in places like this. But the man, still nameless to the people watching, did not flinch. He remained still, his bag resting gently on his shoulder, his gaze locked forward. He knew this moment. He had imagined it, lived it. He had rehearsed this entry, this sentence, this stillness in his mind 1,000 times. He had waited 50 years for it. And today, Samuel J. Booker was ready. Charles Denton's polished shoes clicked with authority against the marble floor as he made his way toward the old man standing at the heart of the Westmore Bank lobby. The sound was intentional, measured heavy, designed to alert everyone in the room that order was about to be restored. He stopped a few feet in front of Samuel J. Booker, his large frame casting a shadow over the elderly man, his hands resting on his belt just inches away from the holster at his side. His voice, when it came, was low, sharp, and full of quiet threat. "Sir, this isn't a place for loitering or whatever performance you think this is," Charles said, the edge in his tone unmistakable. "I'm going to need you to turn around and walk out the way you came before things get more complicated than they need to be." From behind the teller counter, several employees had stopped working, their curiosity piqued by the unusual scene. Joshua and Mabel, still half hiding behind their monitors, leaned closer to the glass to get a better look. A few feet away, Linda Carr, the branch manager, stepped out of her office, alerted by the murmurs and the sound of laughter that still lingered. She was a tall woman in her late 40s with neatly styled blonde hair and a habit of squinting when trying to hide disdain. Her heels tapped sharply as she approached, stopping beside Charles with a glance that said she didn't appreciate being dragged out for a distraction like this. Samuel remained completely still. He didn't back away. He didn't even blink. His face was calm, his gaze steady, as if he had expected every word, every insult, every attempt to push him out the door. And then softly, but with crystal clarity, he spoke again. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice weathered but unwavering. "I've come to reclaim what's mine, something this bank took from me 50 years ago." The words didn't stir laughter this time. They lingered in the air, sharp and heavy, cutting through the last remnants of mockery. For a moment, even Charles seemed unsure how to respond. He shifted slightly, caught off guard by the steadiness in Samuel's tone, the authority it carried, the way it made the surrounding buzz of the bank seem suddenly irrelevant. Linda crossed her arms, clearly impatient. "Mr. Booker, was it?" she asked, her voice clipped and managerial. "This bank has existed under the Monroe family for generations. I'm not sure what you believe happened, but if you're confused or need help, we can certainly direct you to someone who—" "I'm not confused," Samuel interrupted, not harshly but firmly enough to stop her words midstream. "And I don't need help. What I need is for someone in this building to stop hiding behind false histories and finally look at the truth." He slowly, deliberately began to lower the canvas bag from his shoulder, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but age, and placed it gently on the marble floor. His movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as if this moment had been etched into his soul long before it came to pass. A murmur passed through the customers and staff. Some craned their necks to see. A few took subtle steps backward, uncertain of what the old man was about to reveal. There was no longer laughter. There was curiosity now, and something else, an unfamiliar discomfort, like the beginning of a reckoning no one had prepared for. Joshua leaned toward Mabel, whispering again, but this time there was no smirk. "He's serious," he said almost too quietly to hear. Mabel didn't answer. She stared at the bag, her mouth slightly open. Charles tensed the fingers on his belt, tightening. "Don't move another inch," he warned, his voice louder now, harsher. "Whatever stunt you're planning ends here. You're trespassing in a private institution, and I won't hesitate to call the police." Samuel looked up, meeting Charles's glare without flinching. His voice, when he spoke again, was soft but powerful, so calm it almost made the threat sound ridiculous. "You can call whoever you need," he said, "but what I'm about to show you doesn't change because you're uncomfortable, doesn't disappear because of a badge or a uniform. The truth's been patient, but I'm done waiting." And then, with every eye in the lobby fixed on him, Samuel J. Booker slowly bent down and began to open the canvas bag. The zipper creaked, reluctant, as though even it knew the weight of what was coming. The entire room fell silent. Customers froze in place, some holding their breath. Linda Carr instinctively took a small step back. Charles's hand hovered an inch closer to his holster, his jaw clenched. But Samuel moved carefully without rush or hesitation. He reached into the bag and pulled out a thick, aged ledger bound in leather, worn smooth by decades of time. The paper inside was yellowed and brittle, but the writing, handwritten in black ink, was still visible. He raised it slowly, letting everyone see it. "This," he said, "is the original ledger of Westmore Bank, dated August 15th, 1952. Signed by me, Samuel J. Booker, the man who built this institution before it was stolen." Silence stretched across the lobby like a taut wire, so tight it felt like one breath might snap it. Behind the counters, even the humming of the machines seemed to fade, and in that breathless moment, no one, neither Linda Carr, nor Charles Denton, nor the smirking Joshua, could say a word, because what they saw in the old man's hand wasn't just a book. It was a doorway into a truth they never expected to face, and Samuel had only just begun to open it. The room was still almost suffocatingly so as Samuel J. Booker held the ledger aloft. His fingers, though wrinkled and trembling, didn't waver as they traced the faded ink, the name he had once written in this very book. Samuel J. Booker, the founder of Westmore Bank. It was as if the weight of the years had been compressed into this single moment, a moment that had waited too long to arrive. The ledger felt like a relic from a forgotten time, a piece of history that had been carefully erased and hidden away for decades. Samuel's voice broke the silence, as measured and deliberate as ever. "This is my legacy," he said, his words heavy with the burden of truth. "The beginning of Westmore Bank was mine. Every brick in this building was laid by my hands, and every dollar, every signature has my name on it." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a call to confront something no one had wanted to face. Almost immediately, the murmurs began growing louder, more skeptical. A few customers exchanged uncertain glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," one woman whispered, barely audible, her voice laced with contempt. "He can't possibly be the founder. This is some kind of scam." Linda Carr, the bank's manager, shifted uneasily as she looked at the ledger, her eyebrows furrowing. She stepped closer to Samuel, her voice cool and dismissive. "Mr. Booker, I don't know what you think you're trying to do here," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "But this is a bank, not a place for hoaxes. This ledger," she waved her hand toward the pages, "it's not real. This is an old man's fantasy, and it's certainly not going to disrupt business here." Charles Denton, the head of security, stepped forward, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He had seen his fair share of disturbances, but this was something else entirely. His hand hovered over his gun holster as he stared at the ledger in Samuel's hand, trying to make sense of what was happening. "This is nothing but a pathetic attempt to cause trouble," Charles said, his voice low and firm. "This isn't even a real ledger. I've been here for years and I've never seen anything like this. You're trying to scam us, old man, and you're going to leave right now before this gets any uglier." Samuel stood tall, unshaken. His eyes met Charles', unblinking, unwavering. The old man's weathered face showed no hint of fear, no hesitation. "You're wrong," Samuel said simply, his voice calm yet heavy with the weight of truth. "This bank was mine, and I'm not going anywhere until you acknowledge what was taken from me." But instead of backing off, the crowd's hostility only intensified. "You're just some old man trying to get attention," one customer sneered, crossing their arms over their chest. "Get out of here before you make a fool of yourself," another voice chimed in. "Yeah, why don't you go back to wherever you came from? This place isn't for you." The laughter from earlier returned, mocking and scornful. It was as though the truth of Samuel's words couldn't even penetrate the dense fog of disbelief and prejudice that clung to the air. Linda, trying to regain control, stepped back and signaled for Charles to take action. "Get him out of here, Charles, now!" Without another word, Charles moved in, grabbing Samuel's arm with more force than necessary. "Let's go, old man," he growled, trying to drag him toward the door. Samuel's feet moved slowly, but he didn't resist. His eyes were locked on the crowd, on the people who mocked him, who couldn't see past the years of bitterness and hatred that had been ingrained in their minds. As Charles shoved him toward the door, Samuel stopped just short of the exit. He paused for a moment, the tension thick in the air, before he turned his head slightly, looking back into the room. His voice, though quiet, was clear and resolute, and it cut through the mocking laughter and the jeers with a sharpness that stunned everyone into silence. "You may kick me out today," Samuel said, his eyes steady and unflinching, "but you can't erase the truth. Not now, not ever." Charles Denton, still standing in front of Samuel, felt his breath catch. For a brief second, the confident, almost cocky expression on his face faltered. The old man didn't seem to be threatening him, not in the way he had anticipated. There was no violence in the gesture, only the quiet strength of a man who knew his truth. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, his thoughts racing. "This isn't possible," he thought. "There's no way this old man built this place." But Samuel's presence, his calm, unwavering certainty, slowly began to shake the foundation of his disbelief. Linda Carr wasn't sure what to make of this scene. Was it a scam? A trick? But the calmness in Samuel's eyes, the sincerity in his voice, had an effect on her. It gnawed at her, the fact that he was so sure, so resolute. She cleared her throat and looked at him, her voice no longer cold but cautious, curious even. "Mr. Booker," she said, her tone attempting to remain professional, "despite the unease creeping in, if you truly are the founder of this bank, why is there no record of your name? Westmore Bank was founded by the Monroe family, and their names are in every history book, every piece of documentation. You're mistaken." Samuel's gaze never left hers. His eyes were like two dark pools deep with history, and they seemed to peer right through her polished exterior to the core of something that had long been buried. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if every word were carefully weighed before leaving his lips. "I'm not mistaken, Mrs. Carr. The Monroes did not found Westmore Bank. They took it from me, erased my name from history because of the color of my skin. They used my labor, my ideas, and when they saw that my presence as a black man was a threat to their power, they conspired to push me out." There was a palpable shift in the air. For a split second, the tension in the room seemed to grow thick enough to touch. A few of the customers who had been watching with skepticism began to look around uncomfortably, their unease starting to show. Some shifted in their seats, others lowered their eyes as if they couldn't meet Samuel's gaze any longer. But Linda, trying to maintain control of the situation, took a deep breath, her professional mask slipping just a little. She spoke again, but this time her voice was softer, more cautious. "And what do you expect us to do with this ledger? It's old, it's fragile. It could be anyone's for all we know." Samuel didn't flinch. He knew what they were thinking, knew that the disbelief would take time to break down, but he wasn't in a rush. He had waited long enough. He slowly placed the ledger back into the bag and with careful precision pulled out a bundle of papers. They were brittle with age, but the official seal of Westmore Bank still gleamed faintly on the top page. He held them up for all to see. "These," he said, his voice thick with emotion now, "are the documents that prove everything. These are the legal papers I filed when they stole the bank from me. They forged signatures, erased my name from every record, and they did it all with the power of their money and their privilege." The room grew quieter. Even Charles, who had been standing tall, now shifted uneasily on his feet. Linda Carr glanced at the papers, then at Samuel. The words were starting to sink in, but she was still not ready to believe them entirely. She turned to Charles as if seeking some reassurance, but Charles's face had paled slightly. His usual bravado was slipping. He stared at the documents, his eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "I don't care about what these papers say," Charles finally muttered, his voice harsh but unsure. "This is Westmore Bank. The Monroes have owned this place for generations. Their name is in every book, every legal document. Who are you to come in here after all this time and say otherwise?" Samuel's response was calm, even more so than before. "I'm the man who built this place," he said. "I'm the man who trusted the wrong people. I'm the man whose life and dreams were stolen because of my skin color. But I'm also the man who will not let this lie stand any longer. The tension in the room grew as if it were an unseen force gathering strength with each word Samuel spoke. There was an undeniable weight in his presence now, a force that no one in the room could ignore. His hands may have been old and weathered, but his resolve was as sharp as it had ever been. Linda's fingers twitched at her sides, her mind racing. She wanted to dismiss him, to believe that this was all some delusional old man's rambling. But the ledger, the papers, and Samuel's voice were all too real. She turned to Charles, looking for a sign of what to do next, but Charles was silent. His face was ashen, his mind clearly battling with the impossible truth Samuel had just laid out before them. Finally, Linda took a breath and looked back at Samuel, her tone softening again, if only a little. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "What is it that you expect to happen here today?" Samuel looked at her, and for the first time the corner of his mouth lifted into the smallest of smiles, as though he had known exactly what would happen. "I want nothing more than what was taken from me," he said. "What was stolen from me, from my children, from my people. Justice. The truth. And for once, I want the world to hear it." The weight of his words hung in the air, and in that moment it seemed as though everyone in the room had taken a collective breath. Samuel was no longer just a man standing in front of a bank counter. He was a symbol of something far larger, a symbol of the many, many others who had been wronged, erased, and forgotten. As Linda processed what Samuel had just said, her own thoughts began to shift. She couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just some old man with a claim to something he never had. This was a man with the truth in his hands, and whether she liked it or not, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Behind her, Charles Denton stood silently, his thoughts in turmoil. He had always believed in the order of things, in the power of his badge, and in the unquestionable authority of the Monroe family. But now, with the undeniable evidence before him, he found himself wondering if he had been protecting the wrong side all these years. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room began to shift. The old man standing there with his fragile papers and his unwavering confidence was slowly but surely forcing everyone to see what had been hidden for far too long. And, with each passing second, the question became clear. What would they do with the truth now that it had been laid bare? It was a question that none of them were ready to answer. Yet for the first time in decades, Samuel J. Booker felt as though the weight of the past was finally starting to lift, if only a little. The tension in the room had thickened, a palpable force that seemed to hang in the air, pressing against everyone present. Samuel J. Booker stood unmoving, the weight of his words still echoing in the marble-floored lobby of Westmore Bank. Charles Denton shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unease creeping into his stance. His hand had inched closer to his holster, a reflex he couldn't seem to control, but the discomfort in the room was now undeniable. He was a man who had always believed in structure, in the simple, unflinching authority of his uniform and the power of the institution he was sworn to protect. But what Samuel had laid before him wasn't just a disruption, it was a challenge, not just to his authority, but to everything he thought he knew about the world. His thoughts raced, fighting to suppress the sudden doubts. This isn't right, he thought. This is not how things are supposed to be. Linda Carr stood frozen beside him, her gaze flicking back and forth between the documents in Samuel's hands and his unwavering, calm face. She could feel the weight of the situation shifting under her feet, could sense that something monumental was unfolding, something she couldn't just ignore or brush off. Her mind was scrambling to maintain the control she'd spent years cultivating in her career. The Monroes had built the bank, they had maintained it, and they had helped shape the community's trust in it. But Samuel's words, his papers, and the haunting certainty in his voice, there was no denying that they carried weight. The fact that she could no longer brush him off was becoming increasingly clear, and with that realization came a growing unease. She needed to act quickly to restore order. But how? What if it's true? She wondered, her stomach sinking. "I don't believe this," Charles said abruptly, breaking the silence. His voice was tinged with an unsettling mixture of disbelief and irritation. He looked down at the gun holster again, his fingers curling and uncurling in agitation. "This is a bank, not a circus," he muttered, his eyes scanning the room. "We don't have time for this nonsense. We'll call the police. Get this old man out of here before... What? Samuel interrupted, his voice steady, but now holding a sharp edge. "Before you have to face the truth." His gaze met Charles's, and for the first time, Charles felt a shiver of uncertainty crawl down his spine. There was no threat in Samuel's eyes, no hostility, but there was something much more unsettling, an unyielding quiet strength. A strength that made Charles question whether he was the one out of place, not the old man in front of him. Linda finally spoke, her voice low but controlled. "Charles, enough." She turned her attention back to Samuel, her brows furrowing in thought. "Mr. Booker, I'm willing to listen, but I need more than just your word and these papers. This is a serious claim, and it's not something we can dismiss lightly. If you're saying you have proof, then we need to see it. All of it." Her words were firm, but they carried a note of caution, as if she were still bracing for a revelation that might be too much to handle. Samuel's face softened for a moment. He didn't respond with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he gently placed the bundle of papers on the counter, his hand steady as he flipped through the brittle pages. The room had fallen quiet again, the faint sound of the air conditioning, the only noise breaking the heavy silence. The customers who had been watching from a distance were now holding their breath, their curiosity replacing their mockery. They weren't sure what they were witnessing, but they knew it was something important, something they couldn't ignore. "There's more," Samuel said, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of everything he had suffered. "This is the ledger from when I founded the bank. But it's not just about the founding. It's about what happened afterward, the lies, the deceit, the erasure of my name. There's a reason the Monroes' names are all over this bank's history, and it's not because they built it. It's because they took it from me. I have the court documents, the testimonies from the time, all of it." He paused, his eyes meeting Linda's. "You think they'll make it easy for you to find the truth. They won't. They'll bury it again, just like they did before. But I'm here to make sure you can't bury it anymore." The words hit Linda harder than she expected. She had always prided herself on her ability to see things through a lens of reason and control, to filter out the noise and focus on what was important. But Samuel's calm, methodical delivery, his quiet confidence, made it harder to maintain that same detachment. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, her hands gripping the counter, as if that might anchor her to some semblance of control. But the more she looked at the evidence before her, the more her doubts grew. Behind her, Charles took a deep breath and stepped back, his hand slowly lowering away from the holster. There was something about Samuel's presence, something about the old man's unwavering commitment to the truth that made the security guard's aggression falter. Charles had always relied on the power of intimidation, on the belief that his role was to protect the system no matter the cost. But here in this moment, the system was crumbling before him, and he was suddenly unsure if he had ever really been on the side of what was right. Linda glanced back at Charles, her eyes briefly meeting his. It was a silent exchange, one that spoke volumes about the shift in power that was happening in that very moment. For the first time, Linda wasn't sure where Charles stood. She wasn't sure where anyone stood anymore. "I need to talk to the board," Linda said finally, her voice steady but tinged with the strain of someone who knew the gravity of the situation. "I can't make this decision alone." "Of course not," Samuel replied softly, his voice carrying no judgment, only understanding. "But you have to know, Mrs. Carr, this isn't just about a bank. It's about what it represents. The lie that's been told for years, the one that keeps us all in our places. This isn't just my story. It's the story of every black man and woman who's been erased, who's been pushed aside, who's been told their history doesn't matter. And it's time for that to change." The room was silent again, but this time there was no laughter, no mocking glances. Instead, there was a heaviness in the air, one that made everyone aware of just how fragile the world they thought they knew really was. And as Linda stood there staring at Samuel, at the papers, at the weight of the history he had uncovered, she knew that something had to change. But the question was, what would she do next? The truth was there. It was undeniable, unshakable. But the world Samuel had built with his hands had been stolen, buried, and replaced by the very system that now stood in opposition to him. And now that system was on the brink of collapse. The only thing that remained was the decision of whether or not to tear it all down. And Linda Carr knew that whatever decision she made, it would change everything. Forever. The atmosphere in the Westmore Bank lobby seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. The weight of Samuel's words hung heavily in the air, and for the first time, Linda Carr felt the cold, unsettling truth of the situation creeping into her thoughts. She glanced at Charles, who stood stiffly beside her, his face hard to read. His usual air of authority had dissolved, replaced by something more uneasy, more human, something she hadn't expected to see in the man who had been her right hand for years. Charles shifted on his feet, still unable to entirely shake off the disbelief, but even he knew that something had changed. But it wasn't just the two of them. The customers who had been chatting idly among themselves, their phones in hand, were now watching with rapt attention. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The silence in the bank was no longer the result of an uncomfortable pause, but rather a growing realization that the foundations of their world were shifting beneath them. Tiana Lopez, a young employee who had been watching from behind the counter, felt the tension in her chest tighten as she took a step forward. She had been silent up until now, trying to keep her distance, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She was new and she wasn't sure where she stood in all of this. But something had changed in her as well. Samuel's calm, his conviction, the undeniable truth he presented, it was impossible to ignore. She walked slowly toward him, her eyes now steady, her hands no longer trembling. Without saying a word, she gently bent down and picked up one of the old faded bills that had fallen from Samuel's bag. She placed it carefully on the counter in front of him, a silent act of support. The eyes of everyone in the room followed her, and for the first time it felt as though they were seeing something beyond just the old man in front of them. As if on cue, another employee, Josh, who had once laughed at Samuel's expense, now stepped forward. He had been one of the first to mock the old man, to scoff at the ridiculousness of his claims, but now his shame was palpable. He took a deep breath, stepping into the space where Tiana had stood just moments before. He bent down slowly and picked up another bill. His movements were hesitant but deliberate. He placed the money next to Tiana's on the counter, his face flushed with the weight of his actions. "I trust you too, Mr. Booker," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry for how I treated you." His apology was sincere, though tinged with the discomfort of having to face his own ignorance. The room was shifting now. Each step taken by the employees, each small gesture created a ripple that spread outwards, making the divide between the old power structure and the rising truth more and more visible. More employees stepped forward, some in tears, others simply standing tall, their resolve growing with each new act of solidarity. Mabel, who had been quietly watching from behind her desk, now stepped up as well, her movements slow, her eyes not quite meeting Samuel's, but still filled with respect. She placed a bill on the counter, and then another employee followed suit, then another, until the entire counter was filled with small symbolic acts, each one a silent yet powerful rejection of the lie they had all been living under for so long. Charles stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief as he watched his colleagues, people he had worked with for years, walk away from him, from the system he had spent his life defending. He wanted to shout, to call them out, to remind them of their place, but the words wouldn't come. His thoughts were a whirlpool of confusion and rage. What are they doing, he thought. They can't just... But the thing was, they could. And they were. Each employee who stepped forward, each one who made that quiet gesture of defiance, was reminding him of something he had forgotten. Truth is powerful. And truth is unstoppable. And it wasn't just the employees. The customers, those who had initially laughed, who had mocked and whispered, were now shifting in their seats. Some had pulled out their phones recording the scene, while others stood still, their eyes no longer filled with disdain, but with something else, curiosity, maybe even a little bit of fear. What they had thought was a joke, a ludicrous claim, was now a confrontation with something deeper, something far more real than they were ready to admit. Linda stood at the back watching as her employees made their stand. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, not wanting to disrupt the flow of the moment, but she knew the weight of what was happening. The bank she had worked for, the one that had become a symbol of success and stability, was slowly being dismantled. She had always believed in the Monroe family's legacy, had always trusted that what they had built was solid, untouchable. But now it was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She looked at Charles again, this time more intently. His shoulders were slumped, his face a mixture of anger and something else, regret maybe, or even fear. He wasn't the man he had been moments ago, and Linda knew that the choice before him was the same as the choice before her. She could keep fighting for the bank, for the lie, or she could join the others in facing the truth. It was then that something shifted in Linda's mind, something that had been quietly gnawing at the back of her thoughts for a while. The customers were watching. Her employees were watching, and she couldn't pretend anymore that what Samuel had brought to light wasn't real. The truth was there, clear and undeniable, And no matter how much she wanted to fight it, she knew she couldn't silence it. Not anymore. Linda's gaze turned back to Samuel. She wasn't sure what to say or even what to do next, but she knew she had to act. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, could feel the change that had begun to take root in the bank and in the people around her. The bank, for all its legacy and all its wealth, was built on a lie, and that lie was about to be exposed no matter how much anyone tried to deny it. Samuel was standing in front of her calm and resolute, and for the first time, Linda saw him not just as the old man with a claim to something long past, but as the living embodiment of justice, a man who had fought and lost, but who had never given up. His struggle had become something much larger than him. It had become a fight for every voice that had been silenced, for every person who had been erased. And now that fight was being won step by step, gesture by gesture. "I'm not asking for revenge," Samuel said, his voice quieter now, but still filled with strength. "I'm asking for what's right. And for once, I want this bank to be what it was supposed to be, a place for everyone, not just for the privileged few. I want it to stand for truth, and I want it to stand for justice." His words, though simple, were enough. They were all the invitation Linda needed. She took a deep breath, stepped forward, and placed her hand on the counter beside the growing pile of bills and papers. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of the decision she had made. "You're right, Mr. Booker. You're absolutely right. This has gone on for too long, and I won't be part of hiding it anymore." And just like that, the world inside Westmore Bank began to change. The old system, the one that had been built on lies and power, was crumbling not with a crash, but with a quiet, deliberate force, a force that had been growing for years and was now unstoppable. The truth had finally been brought to light, and there was no going back. The room was heavy with silence, but now there was an undeniable shift in the air, a quiet but palpable change in the atmosphere. Linda Carr's words had settled over the bank like a tide pulling everything in its wake. For the first time in decades, the weight of history, the history that had been buried under layers of lies and deceit, was finally being acknowledged. There was no turning back now. The foundation of the Westmore Bank, built on falsehoods, had been cracked open. The truth had not only been revealed, but was now being embraced slowly but surely by those who had once kept their eyes closed. Samuel J. Booker stood still, his expression calm but no longer distant. The fire that had burned inside him for so many years had been reignited not by the rage of revenge, but by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his fight had not been in vain. The truth was out, and now there were those who would carry it forward. But the battle was far from over. Charles Denton, still standing by Linda's side, seemed to be struggling to find his place in this new world. He had always been a man of order, a man who trusted in the rules, in the structure that had defined his life. But now that structure was crumbling, and he was being forced to face a reality that did not fit into the neat boxes he had always relied upon. The employees who had once respected him now saw him differently, as if he had failed them, as if he had failed to see the truth for what it was. His heart was heavy not with shame, but with uncertainty. He had spent his life maintaining order, but now the very order he had sworn to protect seemed like a farce. His eyes darted from Samuel to Linda, then back to the others who had gathered around the counter, showing their solidarity with the old man. Linda Charles said, his voice tight, but laced with frustration, "You can't seriously be thinking about letting this happen. We've built this place, our careers, everything on the foundation that the Monroes gave us. If we start questioning everything now, where does it end?" Linda turned toward him, her face pale but resolute. She had heard his argument before, the same one that had kept her quiet, that had kept her in line for so long. She had justified it, told herself that the Monroes were a necessary part of the institution's success. But now, looking at Samuel, looking at her colleagues, who had stepped forward, she couldn't pretend anymore. "Where does it end, Charles?" she asked, her voice steady but piercing. "I've spent my whole life upholding a system that was built on lies, and now we're standing in front of the man who made this place, the man who was erased. And you want to keep pretending we don't owe him the truth?" The words hit Charles like a physical blow, and for a moment he was speechless. The anger, the confusion, the fear, everything he had held onto for so long was slipping away. Samuel had not just come into the bank as an intruder. He had come as a man whose life had been stolen, a man who had every right to reclaim what had been wrongfully taken. And now, as the truth spread throughout the room, as more and more employees came to stand by, Samuel Charles felt the weight of his own choices pressing in on him. Behind him, the other employees were still taking steps forward, quietly placing bills on the counter, each one a small act of defiance against the lie they had been forced to live with. Tiana, Josh, Mabel, even the senior staff who had once been hesitant to stand against the power of the Monroes, all of them were now united in their recognition of the truth. And it was this unity, this collective recognition, that was breaking Charles's resolve. Samuel Linda began again, her voice softer this time. "I don't know how to fix this, but I will make sure the board knows what we're dealing with. I'll take this to them. This bank, it has to change. But it won't happen overnight. We'll need time to figure out how we move forward." Samuel nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. He had waited a lifetime for this moment, not just for the bank to acknowledge him, but for the world to acknowledge the injustice that had shaped his life and the lives of so many others. But he understood the complexity of what Linda was facing. The Monroes were a powerful family, and their influence ran deep. For her to act for her to make a stand was no small thing. "You have time," Samuel said quietly, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "But don't waste it. The truth will not wait forever." Linda nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. It wasn't just about righting the wrongs of the past. It was about reshaping the future, making sure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be resistance, that the Monroes would fight tooth and nail to protect their legacy. But standing here in front of Samuel, she realized that the fight was necessary, that it was no longer just about business, it was about justice. And then, without another word, Samuel turned toward the door. The weight of the moment seemed to hang around him like a cloak, his every step measured slow, but filled with purpose. As he walked past the employees who had stood by him, he nodded his head slightly in acknowledgement. They had helped him in ways they didn't even fully understand. They had made a stand, and in doing so, they had shown that they were willing to fight for something greater than themselves. As Samuel reached the door, he paused. He turned slightly to look back at the bank, at the employees, at the customers who were still standing in stunned silence. The weight of everything he had been through, the years of injustice, the years of silence, seemed to finally lift off his shoulders. He had not won yet, but he had taken the first step. And as he stepped out into the cold air, the doors of Westmore Bank swung shut behind him, leaving an uncertain but changing world inside. In that silence, Linda felt something stir within her. The first step had been taken, and now the real work would begin. The truth would not be buried again, not if she had anything to say about it. The challenge ahead was immense. The road would be long, filled with obstacles, both legal and personal. But for the first time, Linda believed that they could win. And perhaps, just perhaps, Samuel Booker's fight for justice would not just change the history of one bank, but the entire system that had allowed it to be forgotten for so long. The door clicked shut behind Samuel, and the silence in the bank grew louder. The employees were looking at Linda now, waiting for her to lead them, waiting for her to give the signal. There was no longer any doubt. She knew what she had to do. The truth was out, and there was no going back. It was time to face the past head on. The door to Westmore Bank closed with a gentle thud behind Samuel J. Booker, but the echo it left behind was anything but soft. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere had changed entirely, not just in tone, but in temperature, in texture, in the way every breath seemed to move with caution and meaning. The same space that had moments ago held laughter, mockery, and dismissal now stood drenched in a strange, quiet reverence. People didn't move, not because they were afraid, but because they understood somewhere deep in their bones that they had just witnessed something greater than a man challenging a bank. They had seen a man reclaim his identity, his history, and perhaps something even more sacred, his dignity. The truth that Samuel had carried with him in that worn canvas bag had not only cracked open the illusion of the bank's perfect legacy, it had revealed the rotting foundation beneath it. And once truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be unspoken. It lingers, it multiplies, and it demands to be reckoned with. Linda Carr stood silently behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge with knuckles pale and tight. She stared not at her employees, not at the customers, but at the empty space where Samuel had stood just moments before. Her mind wasn't quiet. It was loud, racing, churning with questions she had never dared to ask until now. What else have we erased, she wondered. How many other names, how many other lives have we paved over to make way for this illusion of stability? She thought of the Monroes, of the history she had defended her whole life, of the pride she had taken in this institution. And now all of it felt fragile, less like a foundation, and more like a wall built to keep truth out. Behind her, the employees still stood near the counter, as if afraid that movement would somehow erase what had just occurred. Tiana Lopez clutched a crumpled old bill in her hand, her gaze distant, filled with thought. Josh wiped his face with his sleeve, red-eyed, his earlier smugness long forgotten. Even Mabel, once indifferent now, sat quietly on the edge of the customer service desk, her eyes not moving from the documents Samuel had left behind. The truth lay in piles of yellowed papers, signatures in faded ink, court records with rejected stamps and bills that bore a logo long buried. It was history, and it was undeniable. In the far corner of the lobby, Charles Denton had taken a seat, not because he was tired, but because the weight of it all had finally forced him to sit. His posture was slouched, his shoulders hunched, not in defiance, but in surrender. He didn't look at anyone. He stared down at his hands, the same hands that had rested on his holster just minutes before, ready to draw a weapon to protect what he now realized was a lie. He had built his identity on being a protector of the rules, a guardian of the bank's order. But now he couldn't even trust the ground he stood on. The badge on his chest felt heavier than ever. A few minutes passed like that. Quiet, still, unspoken. Then Linda slowly straightened her back and turned to face her staff. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft but firm, steady, despite the whirlwind inside her. "Everyone, I need you to listen," she began. "What happened today, what Mr. Booker showed us, wasn't just a man coming in with old papers. It wasn't just a protest or a disruption or some act of anger. It was truth. A truth we were never taught. A truth this institution never wanted us to see." Her gaze moved from one employee to the next, resting briefly on each of them, as if asking them to hold on to her words. "We've built our careers inside a story that was written without honesty. And we've told ourselves it didn't matter. But it does. It always has." She paused, then took a deep breath. "Tomorrow morning, I will bring everything Mr. Booker left here to the board of directors. Every document, every record, every signature. I'll demand an independent legal review, and I'll speak for what I saw today, not just as a manager, but as a witness. I can't promise what they'll do, and I know the Monroes won't take it lightly, but I won't let this be buried again." Her voice faltered slightly, but she pushed through. "You all saw it. You stood up, and I want you to know I'm proud of you. This is what courage looks like." The employees said nothing at first, but their eyes spoke louder than words, some nodding, others simply holding their chins a little higher. Sir. They had seen what needed to be seen, and, more importantly, they had believed. Outside the bank, Samuel Booker walked down East Haven's Main Street with slow, deliberate steps. The wind tugged at the edges of his coat, the late afternoon sun warming the top of his cap. His old canvas bag, now lighter in weight but heavier in meaning, swung gently at his side. He didn't need to look back at the bank. He had left everything he needed to say behind those glass doors, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel dismissed. He didn't feel erased. He felt seen. As he walked past storefronts and strangers, some people paused, unsure why the old man with the ragged coat felt somehow larger than life. A few even nodded to him with respect, sensing something important had just occurred. Samuel didn't smile. Not yet. There was still a long road ahead. Legal battles, headlines, doubt, resistance. But he had done what needed to be done. He had spoken the truth. And now that truth would do what truth always does, spread echo root itself into the cracks of falsehood until the whole facade could no longer stand. Back inside the bank, Linda Carr remained standing at the center of the lobby. The quiet murmurs of her staff had begun again. Low voices hushed conversations, questions about what came next. She didn't have all the answers, but she had taken the first step. And that was more than she could have imagined just an hour ago. That night, news of what had happened began to trickle through the streets of East Haven, first as whispers, then as social media posts, then as questions from reporters, legal experts, and historians who had long suspected that the history of Westmore Bank wasn't as noble as it seemed. Within days, the story reached headlines. Within weeks, the Monroe family issued a statement, defensive, calculated, but trembling beneath the weight of undeniable proof. and within months, Samuel Booker's name was no longer a forgotten footnote. It was on the lips of students in classrooms, etched into historical records, and carved into a new plaque installed inside the lobby of Westmore Bank. It read, "Founded by Samuel J. Booker, 1952. Visionary, builder, truth-bearer. History may forget, but justice remembers." And beneath that plaque stood a bronze sculpture, not grand, not towering, but humble and strong, of a man with a weathered coat, a worn cap, and a canvas bag over his shoulder, standing proud. Because some truths may come late, but when they arrive, they rewrite everything. And Samuel J. Booker, who had once been erased, would never be invisible again. But justice did not end with a plaque or a quiet moment of reflection. The story of Samuel J. Booker and the stolen truth behind Westmore Bank spread quickly, first through whispers, then through headlines, and finally through formal investigations that reached far beyond the walls of the bank itself. The public outcry was swift and unforgiving. Local reporters began tracing the Monroe family's legacy, and what they uncovered wasn't just an old injustice, it was a deeply embedded history of systemic fraud, discrimination, and erasure. The documents Samuel had revealed were just the beginning. A wave of journalists and civil rights lawyers, empowered by the newfound evidence, uncovered decades of suppressed records, forged signatures, used to transfer property rights, covert meetings with judges and politicians, a pattern of rejecting black business loan applications while approving less qualified white applicants, and an orchestrated effort to erase Samuel's name from every historical record connected to the bank's origin. The lie wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate, calculated, and now exposed. Federal agencies launched investigations. The Monroe family, once seen as philanthropic pillars of East Haven, quickly found themselves at the center of a national scandal. The media tore into their pristine image. Their board seats were stripped. Public relations firms dropped them. Universities and institutions began removing their name from scholarship programs, library wings, and buildings quietly, almost shamefully. Statues were taken down. Streets were renamed. The fallout didn't stop there. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of minority families who had been denied fair access to loans for decades under Monroe-era policy. Evidence of redlining, racial profiling, and manipulated account closures emerged. The family's vast fortune, built not just on deception, but on generational exclusion, was frozen under federal injunction. Assets were seized, private estates were sold off to pay legal reparations. And then came the historic ruling. In a unanimous decision, the federal court recognized Samuel J. Booker as the rightful founder of Westmore Bank. His legacy was to be publicly restored, his family awarded restitution, and his name permanently inscribed in the legal and financial history of the institution. The judgment declared that a system which allows stolen foundations to endure is not a system of justice, but one of cowardice. That line would later be quoted in textbooks, speeches, and museum walls across the country. But for Samuel, now walking quietly through the streets of East Haven as the sun began to set, none of it was about revenge. Not the money, not the headlines, not the spectacle. He had lived his life in the shadows, dismissed and erased, fighting a battle no one believed in. And now he had done the impossible. He had made the world stop and look, really look. Not at the suit and tie on a board member, but at the hands that had laid the first brick, at the truth they had all been taught to ignore. The Monroe name would fade from memory, not as builders, but as thieves. And Samuel's name, once deleted with ink and silence, now stood carved in stone in records and in the hearts of everyone who witnessed the day a forgotten man walked into a bank and reclaimed his place in history. Because in the end, truth is heavier than legacy. And no empire built on lies can withstand the quiet, unstoppable weight of a man who never gave up. Because when truth rises, no name, no matter how powerful, can outrun it. And the Monroes, for all their wealth and legacy, learned that justice, though delayed, is never denied. The story of Samuel J. Booker and the truth behind Westmore Bank is more than just a tale of injustice reclaimed. It's a powerful reminder that history, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its voice again. It showed us that true courage doesn't always come in loud defiance, but sometimes in the quiet, steady pursuit of justice. Samuel's unwavering strength taught us that dignity once taken can still be reclaimed, and when it is, it inspires change that ripples far beyond one man's story. His journey reminds us all that real power lies not in wealth or legacy, but in truth, integrity, and the refusal to let lies define our future. And what about you? If you were in Samuel's shoes, would you have had the courage to return and demand the truth be heard? Would you have stood up in the face of silence and denial? If this story moved you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know how you would have responded. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you more stories that matter. Thank you for standing with us and for listening.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.